Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. It has been a while since I have done a proper reading wrap up, so I thought I would sit down and talk about some of my favorite reads from summer 2021. I can't believe summer is almost over, but you know what? The humidity in my apartment right now is truly unacceptable, so I can't say that I'm sorry that fall is just around the corner, but I hope you are all making the most of what's left of summer so far, and I would also love to hear what books you have been reading and loving this summer. I have 5 books here that I want to highlight in particular as kind of the best books that I've read over the past few months, and then I will do a quick rundown of all the other books I read this summer. I have touched on a few of these in some recent reading vlogs and other videos, but I also have several books here that I haven't talked about at all yet, including a book that might be one of my favorite reads of the year so far. But before I get into that, I wanted to mention that today's video is kindly sponsored by GlassesUSA.com. GlassesUSA.com offers over 9,000 pairs of eyeglasses and sunglasses in almost every imaginable style and color, including their own in-house brands like their Muse with Hilary Duff collection and designer brands like Ray-Ban, Gucci, and Armani. GlassesUSA.com offers glasses at up to 70% off retail prices, starting as low as $30 for a complete prescription pair. I wanted to show you some of the different prescription frames that I got from GlassesUSA.com. The first are the ones that I'm wearing now, which is the Atoto Magnus in gold, which I really like because they're a kind of retro aviator shape that makes me feel more cool and stylish than I actually am. I also got the Atoto Danielle in this very pretty rose gold pink, and these to me feel like kind of perfect classy glasses for work meetings. And then I've never had glasses that are a really bold color before, and so I also got the Muse Gladys glasses, which are blue and teal, and then they also have this kind of fun flash of magenta at the top of the frames too. These are what I think of as my kind of fun librarian glasses. And lastly, for the first time in my life, I finally got a pair of prescription sunglasses, red Amelia E Alabama sunglasses, and I honestly love them. I just kind of keep them in my bag at all times and whip them out whenever I need them. What's great about GlassesUSA.com is that you can use any prescription on almost every pair of their frames. They have a great virtual try-on, which allows you to see what the glasses will look like on your face. And for any of you out there who have perfect 20/20 vision, GlassesUSA.com also has a fantastic collection of non-prescription blue light blocking lenses, which is really great if you happen to have been spending a lot of time in front of screens over the last 18 months. GlassesUSA.com offers a risk-free shopping experience with free shipping and returns, a 100% money-back guarantee within 14 days of delivery, and a 365-day product warranty. So if you're interested in checking out GlassesUSA.com, I'm including links to my glasses down below and a link to get 65% off your first pair of frames. And without further ado, let's get into my favorite reads of summer 2021. And I should preface this by saying that I found myself drawn to kind of 2 different sorts of books this summer. On the one hand, I read a lot of your classic easy, breezy, escapist summer reads. Lots of romance novels, a little bit of fantasy, some small town, cozy novel vibes. And then on the other hand, I read several books by Balkan writers about war, exile, and being a refugee from a country that no longer exists. So most of the books here fall into one of those 2 very different categories, but I am going to kick things off with the lighter, beachier fare, and definitely the best beach read that I read this summer was People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry. I recently did a full review of this novel talking about why I think it is a really fantastic, successful execution of the friends to lovers trope. The book follows Alex and Poppy, who have been friends for over a decade and take a vacation together every summer until one year they have a horrible falling out in Croatia. So the book opens with a kind of angst and estrangement that you don't normally find in friends to lovers, and the story is framed around this trip that Alex and Poppy take to Palm Springs to ostensibly try to save the friendship, although little do they know they're actually going to fall in love. And then there are flashbacks to all of the trips that they've taken together over the last 10 years, kind of woven throughout the book. And as I have said in multiple videos by now, I really loved this book. I recommend it even if you're not crazy about the friends to lovers trope, and even if you weren't like a mega fan of beach read. I liked this book quite a bit more than beach read. It's a great kind of slow burn romance if you're into that kind of vibe. And the conflict is also refreshingly believable and realistic, which is sadly all too rare in contemporary romance. And I also think it's a really great starter romance if you are at all interested in dipping your toe into the genre for the first time. Another highlight of my breezy summer reading is a book that I mentioned at the very end of my summer reading vlog a couple of weeks ago, but I wanted to give it an extra shout out here because it is a book that I really enjoyed while reading it, but that I have only grown more and more fond of in the weeks since, and that book is Early Morning Riser by Katherine Heiny. This is a novel set in the small town of Boyne City in northern Michigan, and it follows a woman named Jane who moves to town to teach second grade and who falls in love with an older man named Duncan, who is a kind of handy, amiable lumberjack himbo who has also slept with seemingly every woman in 3 counties. And the book follows Jane and Duncan and their kind of ragtag group of friends, which includes Duncan's ex-wife Aggie, Frida the mandolin player, and a young man named Jimmy Jellicoe who works for Duncan. And if that all sounds just a little bit too twee for your taste, I will say that Katherine Heiny balances any kind of small town quirkiness with an extremely dry and knowing sense of humor. And while there is genuine sweetness and big-heartedness in parts of this book, it's always cut through by a very sharp and sardonic wit. And this might sound a little bit weird, but the more I think about it, the more I think that this book really is kind of a perfect marriage between a very understated British kind of humor and Midwestern characters and sensibility. And Katherine Heiny has lived in both London and Boyne City, so that theory is maybe not as out of left field as it may sound. And I actually think that that particular combination of like earnestness that doesn't take itself too seriously is part of why this book felt different from any other book that I've read before. I found it so smart and so funny, but also so genuinely heartfelt and kind of life-affirming, but in a way that somehow wasn't like cloyingly saccharine. There's a line in the book that kind of sums up the essence of it, where Jane is driving home on a winter night and it says, "Darkness fell as she drove home, and when she pulled into her own driveway, the lighted windows of her house glowed like promises to all the world's weary travelers. Winter would be long, and Jane didn't look forward to it, but that glowy window thing was awfully nice." I did also want to note that Jimmy Jellicoe is a character in the book who other people at times refer to as simple-minded, and Jane in particular often has very unkind thoughts about him and harbors a kind of unreasonable resentment towards him at times, particularly at the beginning of the book, mostly because she has, in a kind of patronizing, self-suffering savior kind of way, decided that she and Duncan are responsible for Jimmy and his well-being. And so that aspect of the book gave me a little bit of pause while I was reading it, just because I wasn't totally sure what Katherine Heiny was doing with it. And although that language and those kinds of ideas did feel very true to small town life, especially in the early 2000s, which is where the book opens, it was also just not the nicest to read at times. But I do think that as the book goes on, you see the full scope of Jimmy's humanity. And I do ultimately think that this is a book about found family and this group of people who all need and love each other in different ways, which I found very moving. But if you've read this book, I would be really curious to hear your thoughts on it and to hear your thoughts on Jimmy as a character and how he was portrayed, because I am definitely open to the idea that I could be off base about all of that. But for now, I do recommend this if you are looking for a book that kind of feels like being tucked into bed on a cold winter night. Moving away from the cozy reads and into the books by Balkan writers that I have read recently, next up I have what is probably my favorite book that I've read over the last couple months, and that is Catch the Rabbit by Lana Bastašić. Bastašić, which was published in Serbo-Croatian a few years ago, and then Lana Bastašić translated it into English herself, which on the one hand is incredibly cool, but on the other hand sad, because it sounds like that is kind of the only way it could have been translated into English. Hashtag Women in Translation Month. But this novel follows Sara, who is a Bosnian woman living in Dublin following the breakup of Yugoslavia and the Balkan Wars, which defined much of her preteen and teenage years. And she has been living abroad for over a decade when she receives a phone call from her childhood friend Leigh, who she has not seen or spoken to in years. And Leigh unceremoniously asks her to kind of drop everything and fly to Bosnia to drive her to Vienna to see her brother Armin, who we soon discover has been missing since the war. So this book quickly becomes a very trippy, surrealist kind of road trip novel with a lot of allusions to Alice in Wonderland and Sara's return to Bosnia being framed as her kind of falling back down the rabbit hole. And Sara is a character who is highly educated, and she's also a writer. And because of that, her narration often feels incredibly stuffed with metaphorical language and kind of bloated with overwrought imagery, which I at first read as a kind of sloppiness or lack of restraint on Lana Bastašić's part. But as the book goes on, you do get a sense of how all of this sort of grasping at language is part of Sara's attempts to find or create some kind of meaning within all of the horrific things that have happened to Leigh and her family and the people of their former country more broadly. And she's trying desperately to find some kind of coherent narrative within the chaos. Sara is Bosnian Serb, which means that her family was largely spared from the violence of the war, whereas Leigh is Bosnian Muslim, which means her family was a target of the ethnic cleansing that was happening at the time. Her brother, like many other young men at the time, disappeared during the war years, and she has remained trapped in Bosnia, working as a waitress and various other odd jobs, and where Sara is constantly trying to construct meaning through language and storytelling. For Leigh, there is no meaning in anything, and she has a great deal of disdain for the stories and poems that Sara writes. And in some ways, that relationship between Sara and Leigh is a little bit reminiscent of the fraught friendship at the center of Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels. And this book has been described as Lewis Carroll meets Elena Ferrante in a Balkanized wonderland. But this book and its surrealism and its kind of narrative messiness ultimately reminded me a lot more of other books about war and people living in the aftermath of war. Particularly, the surrealism of it all reminded me a lot of certain aspects of The Sorrow of War by Bao Ninh. And Lana Bastašić also doesn't spoon feed you any information, so a lot of the history and the kind of inter-ethnic tensions and dynamics all remain sort of subtext. So I can see this being a frustrating read on that level, but at the same time, I found it to be just so compelling and incredibly haunting and really, really effective. And so I really, really recommend checking this one out, especially if you are looking for books to read for Women in Translation Month. And the next book I read and really ended up admiring a lot was The Ministry of Pain by Dubravka Ugresic, who is a writer from what is now Croatia who has been living in Amsterdam since the mid-90s. And this book follows a Yugoslavian academic who finds herself similarly displaced in Amsterdam following the Balkan Wars, and she ends up teaching Yugoslavian literature to a group of fellow Yugo exiles in the city. And like Catch the Rabbit, The Ministry of Pain is a somewhat surreal kind of book. In many ways, it's even less coherent when it comes to kind of a central narrative. It's often very cerebral and at times quite disturbing. And because of that, it is a slow and difficult kind of read, but I also found it incredibly compelling, particularly in the way that it looks at the incredibly powerful but ultimately quite arbitrary nature of things like language and nations and ethnicity and identity, and what it means to come from a country where within that country thousands of people were slaughtered for supposed meaningful differences, but then outside that country as exiles you are all suddenly our people again, speaking our language. The book also looks at the concept of Yugo nostalgia, a kind of collective grief and wistfulness for a shared past and for what Yugoslavia could have or should have been. And yeah, like I said, this isn't a particularly pleasant or easy kind of read, but at the same time it contains so many gems and so many incisive insights about war and exile and the meaning of home. Things like a language is a dialect backed by an army, or this passage about the kind of collective experience of exile. There were times when we accepted our fuzzy collective identity and times when we rejected it in disgust. Over and over I heard people say, it's not my war, and it wasn't our war, but it was our war too, because if it hadn't been our war too, we wouldn't have been here now. Because if it had been our war, we wouldn't have been here either. And then lastly, for my best books of summer 2021, I have My Heart by Semezdin Mehmedinović, who is a writer originally from Bosnia who survived the siege of Sarajevo and then emigrated to America. And this is a loosely autobiographical novel in 3 parts. The first part is about a character named Semezdin who suffers a heart attack at the age of 50. The second part is about a road trip that he then takes with his adult son through the American Southwest. And then the last section of the book is about his wife Sonia's stroke and her rehabilitation and attempts to kind of recover her memory after the fact. And like Catch the Rabbit and the Ministry of Pain, My Heart reflects a great deal on the experience of being displaced from one's homeland and being severed in so many ways from your essential identities. And it again looks at the extremely relative nature of identity and those things that define us most. When Semezdin finds himself sharing a hospital room with a Slovakian man, for example, we see 2 people who in their homelands are from entirely different places, but who in a Washington DC hospital ward are as good as the same. When Semezdin is road tripping in Arizona, many people regard him as just another old white man. They don't know from looking at him that he's Muslim and has been persecuted for it, and they don't realize that he's from somewhere else until he starts speaking, at which point he becomes immediately foreign. This is also very much a book about mortality, and it looks at the unique kind of dread and sadness associated with dying away from one's home or losing your memory of home. So it is a quieter and more meditative book, and although it does at times feel a little bit like old man reflecting on his life and getting older, there are some very lovely moments and observations throughout, like the way that he talks about falling in love with his wife, or the deep regrets that he has that his son lost part of his childhood to war. And while I didn't love this quite as much as Catch the Rabbit or The Ministry of Pain, I do think that the experience of reading them all closely together was really enriching. And it is interesting to note how these 3 books all eschew a traditional linear narrative, how they're all incredibly fixated on language and the idea of language, and how they all explore in different ways the idea of individual identity and collective identity, and where the individual and the self fits in kind of collective shared history. So reading those 3 books one after the other was definitely one of the highlights of my summer reading this year. And then most of the other books that I read this summer were largely contemporary romances. I talked about One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston in my recent summer reading vlog, and that is a book that I enjoyed while I was reading it, but that I have grown less and less fond of as time has gone on, mostly because the main character was kind of unremarkable at best, and also because I think the whole book was trying to do too much, like romance, queer history, found family, coming of age, love letter to New York, time travel. And because of that, it kind of felt like it was stretched in too many different directions and didn't do any one thing exceptionally well. I also talked about Act Your Age, Eve Brown by Talia Hibbert in my summer reading vlog. This is another book that I enjoyed but didn't love, mostly because it didn't have that much going for it in terms of plot or kind of narrative structure of any kind. It has a really cute premise about a kind of hot mess heroine getting a job at a bed and breakfast run by a really uptight type A sort of hero, but then it didn't do as much with that premise or that setting as I would have hoped. I also read You Had Me at Hola by Alexis Daria, which in contrast had a really great premise and did a lot with it. It is a romance novel about two telenovela stars who are cast as love interests and who of course then end up falling in love in real life, and it very smartly incorporates the buildup of the tension between the characters in the show with the buildup of tension and chemistry between the characters in real life. So yeah, I enjoyed this one too. The one place where it kind of stumbles is that the conflict is genuinely stupid and the characters act really stupidly during it, so that kind of turned me off at the very end, but I do recommend it if you're looking for a fun contemporary rom-com. And then the last romance that I read this summer was Love at First by Kate Clayborn, which truly had no plot whatsoever. It's technically about a guy who inherits his uncle's apartment and is intent on kind of renting it out as a sort of Airbnb unit, and then one of the women living in the apartment community does everything in her power to try and sabotage that. But that is like truly window dressing that barely factors into a book that is ultimately mostly about feelings. And I have to say this book was quite different from most contemporary romances I've read in that neither the story nor the characters were memorable in the slightest, and yet the way that Kate Clayborn wrote about the feelings that those characters had for each other and the kind of overwhelming feeling of falling in love was so lovely and delicate and earnest in a way that ultimately did make the book overall weirdly memorable, and it did make me want to potentially check out some of her other books. So if any of you out there have read Kate Clayborn and have thoughts on her and can tell me if she has other books like this but with plot, that would be great. And then lastly, at the very start of the summer, I also read Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, which is hilarious to me now because I had so much fun reading that book in the moment. It is so different from anything that I usually read. It's a YA fantasy heist novel about these incredibly hardened and cynical like 17-year-old criminals. It's incredibly angsty. It was a really fun time, and yet I have truly not thought about that book once since finishing it, even though I did go out and buy the second book right away, fully intending to read it. But yeah, it just did not stick with me at all for whatever reason. I kind of wonder if it's because I'm like too old or just at a place in my life where those kinds of characters and that kind of angst doesn't imprint itself on me in the way that it might have like 10 years ago. But you know, it was fun while it lasted. Those are all the books I read this summer. Let me know if you have read any of the books that I mentioned today and if you have thoughts on them. Definitely let me know more generally what books you have been reading and loving this summer, and if you have any fall reading plans that you're already starting to look forward to. Thanks again to GlassesUSA.com for sponsoring this video. You can check out the links in the description box below to get 65% off your first pair of frames. And as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!